Good. Okay, I'm going to call to order the Wednesday, October 11th Portsmouth Planning Board meeting of 2023. Item number one, agenda continuances, modifications. Mr. Lozinski, there are none. That's great. Item two is the approval of planning board meeting minutes for May 10th and August 16th. Let's start with the May 10th. What is the pleasure of the board?
Back in a couple of months this round. Couple minor ones on the motion, just page number.
Microphone,
Sorry.
yeah, sorry about that.
Page number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Just very minor. Number one, I think the intent of that original edit was to say, subject to third-party review / consultation by the town for the drainage proposal prior to or concurrent with state review. I'd just change it to prior to state review. Right now it reads to or with. And then second to last page. It says in one part, and to add, continue to meet and incorporate comments early with the review of the technical review board. And then in the paragraph 2 says continue to meet, incorporate. It basically says it twice. So I'd say in the first part after, as consistent with ordinances that are at or exceeding what has already approved. I'm not sure what that is. But it's just comma there and say, and incorporate the following considerations. And that whole blurb to add, continue to meet and incorporate comments early, whatever that is, can be taken out because it's in the paragraph 2.
You have anything else there, Mr. Tibbetts?
In those sub paragraphs there, I would say, this first one says, public health and safety concerns. Instead of presented, I would just change to are addressed. Number 2 says continual meet and incorporate comments from, I would say continue to meet with and incorporate comments from the technical review board early in the design process.
You got those?
That's
Good.
the only,
Okay.
that's the only changes. I can repeat anything there. I know that was quick.
You're all set with that? I only had one under agenda item 5. It's actually page 1, 2, 3, 4. Second paragraph, it should say Attorney Jackson or Attorney J. Russell Jackson. That's the only one I picked up on. Anything else, Mr. Tibbetts, or any members of the board?
I just had one on page 8, paragraph where the copy did not conform to current zoning, instead of conform.
Okay, anything else? So, good idea, Mr. Solicitor. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, what's the pleasure of the board? You want to make a motion to accept them with changes, or do we want to wait?
I'll make a motion to accept the May 10th minutes with changes proposed tonight.
I'll second it.
Okay, we got a motion made and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Next up is the regular meeting of August 16th, 2023, those minutes. What's the pleasure of the board?
You want to go by Mr. Lopes or Mr. Lopes Jr.?
I'll answer to either.
Then it sounds good to me.
All right,
Make a motion to, for the August 16th minutes as written.
is there a second?
Second.
Ms. Wilson, okay, motion made and second. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Okay. Item number 3, affordable housing education. Discussion with Melina Lodge, Executive Director of the Housing Network of Rhode Island and Community Housing Land Trust of Rhode Island. Thank you.
I invited Melina Lodge to speak regarding some affordable housing education. She is basically probably the smartest person I know in regards to affordable housing. I've known Melina since grad school, and this is her main line of work. She
Yes.
is in charge of Community Housing Land Trust of Rhode Island and the Executive Director of Housing Network of RI. We are a little over our 2% affordable housing percentage here in Portsmouth, and later on in the docket, you'll see that there's been some legislative changes, statutory requirements with the idea of those changes to get some more affordable housing in Rhode Island. We are here, Melina's here to talk about just some education. She's gonna speak from a very preliminary standpoint in how we can get these affordable units in Portsmouth.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
For the record, could you just state your full name and your address?
Sure.
Thank you.
Melina Lodge, 325 Greenwood Ave, Warwick, Rhode Island.
Thank you.
So I don't have a formal presentation. I haven't found that to be productive since most people have their own sorts of questions and then the presentation gets derailed and then it finds out I should have just been prepared to answer questions. So I can certainly do that. And as Leah mentioned, so the Housing Network of Rhode Island, we're the trade association for at present 14 nonprofit developers across the state of Rhode Island who have built probably 90% of the affordable housing that you see here. Probably most known to you as a member of ours would be Church Community Housing. And I believe they have that senior community center project with you guys. So our role in that space largely is to serve as housing policy advocates. So I spend a lot of my time at the State House. So I'm well versed with the legislation that passed last session and would be remiss if I didn't say spent a significant amount of time writing and working on the bills. I think the first step to really developing affordable housing is approaching it from a desire of wanting to develop affordable housing. I think when you approach a problem, and I appreciate that it is challenging, from a position of we can't, period, it's going to inform the outcome. So I think really thinking about where are there opportunities? For sure, you can't build everything. Not all places are appropriate for development or types of development or higher densities or types of development, types of units. So I think it's important to think about, what are the opportunities that you do have on hand? Our other role, as Leah mentioned, is we have a second nonprofit that I run in my free time. The Community Housing Land Trust, we serve as a monitoring agent for affordable housing units, largely for municipally subsidized units. So anything coming through the town in an inclusionary zoning way or a comp permit, that developer, generally private, would need to come out, get a monitoring agent. We serve as a third party neutral, right? Like we don't have any skin in the game as far as we get a profit or anything like that when the development gets leased up. And our responsibility is to ensure that the will of the planning board is in fact reflected in that development, and that the people who either purchase homes or rent homes in that development meet the actual income criteria. So we're responsible for screening tenants or homeowners, working through the closing process. If they're rental units, they're recertified every year for eligibility. Homeowners, at point of resale, they can sell their properties at any time, but they would contact our office. We would set the maximum sales price, and the next buyer would be low income. So we're responsible for facilitating that. We have approximately 500-ish units around the state, with about 300 units in pipeline at present. So we are the largest monitoring agent. I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions based on all of that.
Any questions thus far?
I had a question. So you
Yeah.
said that if someone buys a unit that is low, moderate income unit,
Mhm.
and they later want to sell it,
Mhm.
is it, are they required to contact? to
Yes.
Sell? Like where is that so they know? Like who knows that? Do they know? Does an
Mhm.
agent that goes to list it know? Is it really clear, or could they sell it under the radar without anyone knowing?
No. So there's a deed restriction that gets recorded on the property. So again, I mean, every monitoring agent's a little bit different. We are the largest, so most of the units in the state follow our process, although the state's working on a sort of consistent process across the board. So a developer will build a unit, right? They know they need to do it. They'll get a monitoring agent, and they're given very clear instructions about how they're going to sell that unit, how that unit gets priced. So we have a process. That person will come in, they complete an application, we'll review their financials, right? And we're working through it. It's not just like we stamp it and they go on their merry way. We're involved right through the closing. And we do a one-on-one counseling session with that home buyer, and we go through exactly, right? The unit has to remain owner occupied year round. You may not rent this unit if it's a home ownership unit. When you go to sell, here is the process. Refinances. We're looking at refinances because we want to make sure that properties are not over leveraged, right? Because we're going to say what the max sales price is. It's not a percentage of the market. An appraiser couldn't come up with it without calling us because it doesn't follow market rate pricing. It's a formulaic price point. So there, we walk through all of that. They get an annual notification from our office that reminds them, like, gentle reminder, you have this type of property. If you want to do any of these types of things, call us, or don't do these things. And then when they want to sell, they'll call us up. We tell them based on the formula what the resale price is. So sometimes it will be very similar to what they paid. Sometimes there might be a modest increase, and sometimes it might be worth less. It's based on income. So really whatever happens with the income targeting, and then the cost of housing, right? So in this moment where interest rates are quite high, units will price lower because more of that applicant's housing payment has to go towards an interest payment. If an interest is lower, more of that money is available for principal. If there's a condo fee or taxes, and as those things shift, right, the sales price will adjust. So there's really no way to predict what it looks like in the future for people. I would say generally people makes a little bit of money, but I wouldn't call it exaggerated. I think I have a unit in southern part of the state right now. I think they've owned it for 10 years. They're gonna, before their real estate costs will be somewhere about $22,000 profit. So
you're saying if they did, like, say they tried to go sell it on their own or something, that at some point, either the lawyer for a bank is going to pick up that it's in the deed and that it has
Yes.
gone through a monitoring agent?
Correct. So there's a restriction on the deed. So we draft that document. It gets recorded that in a municipally subsidized development, the town is a party to that restriction. So Leah would sign the restriction. If it was me, I would draft it. The town would sign it. The seller would sign it. The buyer would sign it. So everybody's aware of it. And then when you go to do a title search, it would come up on the deed for that buyer. So people have certainly attempted to sell units. But they always, by the time you get to a closing and there's a title search, they always pop up. So we've never really had them sell We've never had a unit sell where it sells. We've had units come up where it's like, they just didn't alert us and I don't get like I have no way to know unless somebody tells me, but it's never sold without us at the end. Okay, so I looked at some data for Portsmouth. So Portsmouth has 63 housing units in total, 7,663. So to get to 10%, you would need 766 units. And at present, you're at 204. So you're at 2.66%, which is a little bit down from 2021. You were at 2.75. And it's important to note on the low mod calculation, the numerator changes every year. You know, you add units, affordable units, right, is the numerator. So as you add those, you are getting credit for them. The denominator of the formula is produced by the census. It's your housing units. So this number, 7,663, will not change for 10 years, which is why most towns saw their percentage go down this year, because people have been adding market rate units at a significantly faster pace than they've been adding affordable units. So we did see across the board a lot of municipalities slide backwards, simply because that bottom number is only getting calculated every 10 years and the top number changes. So you might see some progress year over year, but I think within the town, understanding for yourselves what type of development you're doing, right? And keeping track of how many units are you adding every year so that you can do some mathematical analysis when you approve a project. You know, does this percentage of affordable units included move us ahead, help us tread water, or does it set us backwards? So I think when the church project, assuming you do nothing else, comes online, you'd be somewhere around 3.37% is my calculation. Was 54 units, I believe, for that project. So, and Leah will have to help me out. What was the name of your ordinance that you have already? The resort? Yes, that one. Is that the only vehicle you guys have that has an inclusionary component? Okay. So I think more tools in your toolbox would be helpful for starters. So just by way of example, so that resort ordinance requires 10%, and 10% requirement is really barely enough to keep you treading water mathematically, because again, you're being assessed on all of the housing units you're adding. So while you might have a very large scale project come in and get something that sounds big, so maybe on a 300 unit thing, you might get 30, and that sounds like a lot. For all of the individual projects that you approve, right? You own a lot and you own a lot, and you own a lot, and you all build a house, right? You have that happen 10 times. You owe one affordable unit. It will never happen from lot. And so you need to figure out how to piggyback those things onto larger scale projects so that you can actually make meaningful progress forward. So just for math example, if your 10% on that resort ordinance was 20%, right? With all you're doing is changing the inclusionary component, lifting the threshold. So take out Christian's project, you know, if you did what you have now, 30 units at, which is the 10%, it would get you to 3.05%. If you just bumped that to 20%, that would get you to 3.44%. If you went to 30%, that would get you to 3.84. So I don't think necessarily it's about creating entirely new things, but figuring out where you have opportunity within things you already have. So this is one where you could simply adjust your threshold for inclusion, or where you might have ordinances that you could add an inclusionary component to. So I'll stop there.
Any questions from the board?
Restricted land, you know, limited land available, so. Fixed developments, 20% higher. The town's still gonna be never gonna get to that number. Are there any towns that are beating that number or like all speculation? The following, what's the penalty? if it's stable? The possible get that?
I think there are towns that have achieved the number. Block Island had achieved it. They fell backwards this year, so they're just below. Burrville has achieved it. There are not at the moment penalties for if you don't. But I think if you read between like the lines here on sort of what has changed in the legislature, you know, there is a housing crisis. I don't know, you know, how much people are aware of that over here, but statewide there is a housing crisis. You know, for Portsmouth, and again, I don't know how much people track data. The median home price for Portsmouth in August of 2023 was $670,000. 22, sorry. In August of 23, that was $927,000 was the median home price, right? So that's median. That's
Did you say 1 year it went from 670?
Yes.
900?
correct. It was a 38% increase. So I believe that given the number of Rhode Islanders, and I do want to be clear, you know, around when we talk about who is impacted by this problem, it is really all Rhode Islanders. At this moment, if you are a household earning $75,000 a year, you cannot actually afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment, rent an apartment anywhere in this state. And I think I'm young-ish. At one point, $75,000 was a really good salary, but it isn't anymore because it doesn't really get you anywhere. And if you're just treading water to pay rent, you're not really able to save and, you know, build up a down payment to come into the home ownership market. So there are not a lot of pathways for people to move through sort of a housing continuum. A lot of people are relegated at this moment to be tenants perpetually, and tenants who are extremely cost burdened, meaning that they're spending over 50% of their income on housing, which means they're not able to participate, you know, in much else, because we're talking about gross income, not net. So if it's 50% gross, we're really talking about probably like 70% net. So I think to be really mindful about who you're talking about. For Portsmouth, the income limit to be eligible for affordable housing, I believe, is about $116,000 a year for a household of 2. So, you know, I find it useful for people to sort of internally reflect, right? Like, where would you fall on this spectrum? Could you actually afford to purchase your home today at what it's worth today? Because in order to afford the home that is, you know, based on the last fact book where the median home price was about $570, you needed to have about $132,000 of income to support that. So I think, you know, people lose sight very quickly about what it costs today, right? I mean, in my own personal life, my mother and father purchased a home, and when I bought my first home, they nearly lost their mind at what I paid for it in 2008. They were like, "You're going to pay that for that?" And it was like, this is cheap compared, you know, we paid $290. I lived in Charlestown. And for them, I grew up in Narragansett. They had paid less for, you know, a house 3 times as big on the water. So for them, it was just totally outside of the scope. And then when I got divorced, I moved to Warwick and was fortunate to buy a home for about $270,000, which is worth double what I paid for it now. Nothing major has changed about the house, right? It's still pretty basic colonial. But I would not really be able to afford my home if I were purchasing it today the way I was able to afford it when I purchased it in 2018. So I think really trying to suss out the opportunities for how you can create these opportunities for people who live in your community or in the periphery communities, and participate in a housing market. And not having those options is really challenging for people. You're predominantly a home ownership community. I think it's about 80% home ownership, 20% rental, based on the last census survey. So I think really digging in and figuring out where you can make adjustments. But I think, you know, when you look at a development in this inclusionary space, it's not really like you're adding more units. It's really thinking about how are you cutting up the pie differently, right? You're still talking about the same 300 units that's being proposed. You're just not talking about 270 of them being market rate and 30 of them being affordable. You're not talking about greater density. You're still approving the same project. You're just talking about how you slice that pie a little bit differently. And I get it, like, yeah, maybe going from 3.05 to 3.44 doesn't feel like a lot. But it's better than not. And I'm sure the people who would benefit, those additional 30 families who would benefit from those units, might feel pretty glad to be able to have that opportunity and might not care quite as much about the percentage. So I think if there are going to be shifts in the future, which I'm sure there will be, I mean, maybe there will be a punitive component to it. I'm not entirely sure. But I think being able to demonstrate progress is certainly better than not being able to demonstrate progress, right? I mean, I don't think anyone's expecting you're going to get to 10% overnight. It's not physically possible. But I do think being able to show that you're doing something is a significantly different lever, to like a leverage tool to talk about if there were changes that were more punitive to say, we're making progress. That's better than not making progress or going backwards.
So we have tried, obviously, we've got an ordinance that's in place, but, by all accounts, it probably has not been as successful as we would have liked it to be. And I think we really only have one development that's actually instituted it, and it didn't really work very well. Here, we have some issues because land costs are so expensive. We don't have a city sewerage. I think when we did the last rewrite of the comp plan, we put in there payment in lieu of, fee in lieu of. Are you seeing other towns like in the position we are where there isn't a whole lot of available land? Is the fee in lieu of a viable solution? And if so, how does it work?
I mean, I would offer that the state of Rhode Island doesn't have a whole lot of land, right? I mean, it's not Texas. So I think we're generally going to be a bit hamstrung. And I think, a lot of our communities are coastal, right? So there are additional constraints. Along the coast, we also, on the western part of the state, we do see ledge and property that is really unbuildable for other reasons, right? So I think we have a lot of land use constraints that we need to mitigate. And I'm, less so than whether we hit the 10% or not. I think it's getting creative to figure out how to maximize. And where things don't work, I would offer that they could work. It's whether the right enforcement has been put into place. I am a monitoring agent for a property in Portsmouth that has not been successful and has been in my portfolio for 11 years. There is no reason that project cannot be successful. That's a choice. And so I think the idea that a developer has to make money on each individual unit is a misnomer. They might present it in that way. And I say this as, somebody who represents, I think we're somewhere around 8,000 housing units across the state. We don't talk about development in a granular way like that. You really talk about the cost of the development as a whole and the revenue of a development as a whole. So if you give a developer a density bonus, because maybe by right they could build 5 units and you've allowed them to do more, so they can do 10 now. And in exchange, they're going to give you 3 affordable units, because let's say they used a comp permit, so that's 20, just about there. The subsidy that offsets whether those affordable units, profit or not profit, is really the additional market rate units. Whether they sell the affordable unit, let's say they sell it for 300 and maybe it costs them 350 to build it. Sure, if you look at that granular level, they lost $50,000 a unit, but they were able to build 3 or 5 additional market rate units that would offset, right, which are not restricted. And that revenue would offset against any losses felt. So I think the discussion around, I would lose money on this unit. Sure, that might in fact happen. It's scaling up to look what happens in the development as a whole and what was the subsidy provided. if there isn't adequate subsidy, then you do need to revisit whether that's the right density. But I'm assuming the developer has worked that out as part of their application, right? Is figuring out what level of density do I need to make this math work is really just a complicated math problem. So I think for the town, where you've approved a project that has a low mod component that has not successfully come online, you hold all the keys on this one, right? There is no mechanism until those units get produced for me to enforce anything. But if you have a planning board record that says you shall produce and it hasn't been produced, the authority to be punitive is in this body, to call that in. And we've seen that in other places where there's a fee for like a daily fee for non-compliance with planning board decisions that sometimes inspires developers to do the thing that they committed to. But I do think, enforcing what you previously approved is a really critical component because it tells every other developer how you're going to behave with their project, right? So they might say, yeah, sure, we'll give you 30 units, but they've watched you do it over here where they didn't give any units at the end. I think it's just a matter of setting a precedent sometimes about what people can expect or not expect from this body. And I realize the body has changed over time, as have, planners. So
I thank you for that. I did want to get back to, because we spent a lot of time in the comp plan putting payment in lieu of,
yes,
because we were told it was probably a viable solution.
no, I don't think it's a viable solution. So the fee in lieu right now at present doesn't yield enough money for you to produce the unit. So I didn't look what it was for Portsmouth, but I think,
It follows Rhode Island housing, whatever that is.
yeah. But there's a range. So right now it ranges between like $45,000 and $65,000 a unit. So let's say you have a developer who comes in and they're going to build 10 units and they need to do 3 affordable. And let's just, for easy math, say $60,000 unit. So they say, we're going to not do this. They're going to pay you $180,000 to not build a unit. You couldn't build 1 unit of affordable housing for $180,000, never mind 3. So we are working on a bill that would change that formula to yield something that would actually produce enough cash flow that you could actually produce a unit.
Mhm.
I think the second problem with fee in lieu, and the bill's been there forever and it hasn't been touched, but I do believe we'll touch it this session, or the hope is that we'll touch it this session, is that in accepting a fee in lieu, which you don't have to, you just would need to codify by ordinance that you don't, is you put yourself behind mathematically, because now the developer has checked the box in saying they've provided the 3 affordable units and they've built their 10, and now you owe 1 affordable unit, but you don't have it and you don't have any way to produce it. So I think if you look at just the math of the calculation, is accepting the fee in lieu, you've now added all of these units to the thing, but you haven't produced any of the affordable units to offset it, and you don't have any meaningful pathway to build it for yourself, or to do an RFP and see if you could get a developer who wants to do it.
Yeah, so I do remember the part of the conversation, we've had a couple of people come in and testify on it when we were listening to the comp plan, but one of the things that we were told was that you just don't necessarily have to build with that unit, but you use that funding to leverage it to do other work, because you have the ability that a developer doesn't, to be able to find funding, just like our housing project here in Portsmouth, where we partnered with Church Community. Is that an alternative, or?
It is, but effectively you've let the private developer off the hook, and now we have to use scarce subsidy dollars that we have in the state, right? That could have gone to a different project. We now have to carry the difference. So let's just say, for easy math's sake, we can build an affordable unit for $200,000 a unit, which we can't, but let's say we can. And you have this 180, but you need to get to 3. So we're short $420,000, which means whatever other sources are out there, which are not limitless, have to come up with the cash. So I think just for me as an advocate, I struggle with that space. Yeah, there might be other places to get the money. There are no guarantees. Funding is highly competitive in this state. Generally, for any pot of money, we are oversubscribed, often 6-1. So, many projects will come back in multiple times. We've had projects apply sometimes 4 or 5 times. Generally, there's one funding round per year. So 4 or 5 times is a very long runway. That's not like every month. So it takes a long time. And as you know, over time, costs go up. So every time there are delays, the project just ends up costing more, which means we need more subsidy. So it is a bit of a circular space where obviously we could guarantee funding for the project. It could move a lot more expeditiously. But again, there are very few projects that are successful in their first round of application. The project you're referring to for church community is a low-income housing tax credit project. We get the small state minimum in the state of Rhode Island, which is about 3 million and change. That's enough for us to do about 3 housing projects a year. I believe in the last round, they got 12 applications. And they were all viable applications, right? So in order to fund those and assume no other project ever, came up, it would take 4 years, 4 rounds to fund those projects. So that is looking at a tax credit where we sell to investors and leverage dollars, but that project still required other subsidy sources to make it work. Very rarely is there enough subsidy from one project. We have really complicated deals. I was at a groundbreaking. Last Friday, there are 12 funding sources in the capital stack on that particular project, which means it has taken multiple years and multiple funders to piece it together. I think the most we've ever seen is about 17. But that's not untypical. We really do have projects, 1 or 2 is really an exception. So sure, it is possible. Whether it's the right strategy, I think my position would be no. I do think a fee in lieu that yields something a bit more substantive that actually would allow you to get much closer to a cost of a unit would be valuable. And then you could contemplate how might you supplant those units into something else, right? Or could you pay a developer to develop them for you if you have town-owned land or some, if you can upzone something that you've already built on, right? I mean, I think Providence just revisited all of its zoning ordinances. So a lot of the properties that, were considered built out in the past are now potentially, if you can make, a siting work on the property, you could in fact add additional buildings. So, and I'm not suggesting that, Portsmouth has to look like Providence, but I think how you approach the problem will actually define to some degree how creative and the depth of the solutions that you can come to. So yeah, I mean, it's complicated, and I do appreciate I was a planner in a former life, so I'm better now, but I think there are a lot of nuances for the state of Rhode Island and the various municipalities. So I think, it isn't actually an effort to say every community has to look the same or produce the same. I think there is value in looking at each space and seeing what are the unique opportunities to that area, what are the challenges that need to be mitigated, and still finding some pathway forward. But I think the days of being able to say, we can't, our hands are tied and we're out, I would offer that I don't think that is, given where we are as a state. I don't know that will be a theme that will be well received within the legislature. And I think, people are suffering. So that's kind of where we're at.
Laura.
You mentioned one that has not been successful for the last 11 years. Is that we said low moderate unit? Why hasn't it been successful?
The developer has very specific ideas about what the property should be sold for and doesn't want to sell the property for less than that. Unfortunately, that's not how this program works. And there have been opportunities where the property could have sold for more. And again, I'm not, I'm not like, it's not an active project for me. It's one I check in occasionally. What's the status? Are we moving? And at one point when interest rates were quite low, the price was, pretty decent. And they didn't sell. It's triggered by, so my enforcement kicks in when there's a deed restriction. So right now, all you have is a planning board decision that says you shall do. If they had built the units and put a restriction on it, I would have a lot more levers as a monitoring agent because I could enforce something. But in this moment, there is nothing there. There's nothing for me to enforce. It's just a planning board decision. So the hammer lives here until those units come online. It would be different if they had sold the units and the homeowner wasn't using the property, appropriately or something. Then I could go in and say, you need to do this, this, and this in order to stay in compliance, or I can do this, this, and this. But they just don't exist. So there's nothing for me to do in this moment until those units become deed restricted units.
And so I'm just confused, has the developer just been sitting on it for 11 years, refusing
Mhm.
to sell it, basically, because not getting,
I don't know what the status of the actual units are, but effectively, yeah.
right, there's one that's low, moderate income. we're talking
My
about.
understanding is there was supposed to be originally 9, and then it was reduced to 4, and 1 has been built.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't get too far down the weeds on a
Mhm.
particular housing developer at this meeting, though.
Probably not.
And-
But I do think, right, again, you have a planning board of record, and I think regardless of what development you're talking about, like, you rendered a decision, you made a decision about what that project was going to look like with the idea that there was going to be some community benefit that came back. And that hasn't materialized. So I do think regardless of what development, right, I would say that about any development that's not producing what it committed to, but has in fact been able to move its market rate units forward and has profited off of that. Right, I think it's really just around how does this body sort of hold the line on where the town stands? And it's a very simple way, I think, to support affordable housing is to ensure that things that are supposed to be built get built.
Thank you. Any other? Do you have any more questions, Nora? You
Well,
good?
I guess without talking specifically about one development, how do we hold the line if it's just, not allowing them to go forward on other things that they come in for approval on, or I'm just, what are the tools that we use to enforce that?
That would depend on the tools that, what happens if someone's in non-compliance with a planning board decision in this? I mean, every town's a little different. Some have fines, like a per day fine. So, I don't know though, because I don't know your planning board procedures explicitly. There's a lot of towns and only one of me.
I don't know if we have monetary. Mr. Solicitor, do you recall offhand? Yeah,
No, I didn't mean specific to this one, but in general, what do we do what can we do when people don't follow?
There are enforcement provisions and regulations in violation of planning board rules generally.
yeah, I think it's left to zoning enforcement though, isn't it? The enforcement officer, I don't recall ever seeing any fines or anything, but I think it's, yeah, okay.
Very, very.
Right. Sure, okay.
And
Right.
we as a body write these, or the town council approves these? Like, who writes these? Like, if we were to make fines, like how do we can just decide to make fines, or that has to go through town council,
It
or
wouldn't go through the town council.
we
It would go-
can just decide to have,
Would go through, the administrative officer, I believe there's several entities, the solicitor, the administrative officer. And we looked at it, I think we could, but it wouldn't be the planning board.
it wouldn't be us.
No, the planning board is not an enforcement. just
Right.
like the zoning
No, I
board.
meant to write them though. You're saying we wouldn't write them, we wouldn't come, who
The
decides?
planning board can writes regulations.
Okay.
And it goes to hearing and can amend the regulations.
Okay, you were saying we don't enforce, is that what you're saying?
You're not an enforcement body. You're not an enforcement officer.
But we're getting ready to, or Leah's getting ready to start the subdivision rewriting process and the zoning ordinance rewriting process. And it looks like the state probably did some of it for us. So at that time, that's when you would talk about how do you put in the enforcement action, but it certainly has to be approved. Has to be open hearings and then approved by the town council and then enacted. That answer your question, Nora?
So we'll talk about it later, is that? basically
That's
what
just what it sounds like.
Okay.
I mean, municipalities hold a lot of local authority, and I appreciate the state sort of creates some parameters, but there is a lot of local control that lives at the local level. I think it's just fully understanding sort of what you can execute and how that can help you, achieve your work, uphold the goals that you've set, and if need be, hold people accountable. So I think it's just a matter of exploring that. But I do think this is a pretty common question, not just related to this topic, but creating ordinances that don't allow fee in lieu, or a lot of times people are like, oh, well, who would create that? And it's like, you. But you have to do something, right? You would have to create it. There's nothing at this moment that's coming from the state that says you must do it this way. There is still a lot of autonomy, I think, for municipalities to shift. And I do think, there's been a lot of autonomy. And I think some of the stuff you're seeing coming forward, in this past session and probably in subsequent sessions is in reaction to really the housing, like where we are in the housing space right now in this state. And that housing is actually truly unaffordable for not just low income people, but, moderate income households that really shouldn't be struggling. We've had people apply for units making $150,000 a year, which is obviously well in excess of the limit. For that household size, and of course, they're very frustrated that they're not eligible for the low mod housing. And I think, sure, that's disappointing, but there's a line for a reason. Otherwise, and the limits are federally come down from the federal government. So, but I do think it speaks to a bigger issue is, why in this state is it that a couple who make $150K a year cannot actually purchase even a modest home, which we're not building anymore. I think it's easy enough to think that people should just build starter homes, but nobody's building starter homes because there are exorbitant costs that come with development. As you've already mentioned, the land costs, construction costs, we're seeing costs, upwards now increase 38-40% increase in construction. The cost of the land use process itself, the number of times people have to come before planning boards and zoning boards for relief. Every time they need an architect rendering to be tweaked, all of that adds to the cost. And so, if you have a small lot, and sure, if you could build a very small house, we work with lots of private developers as well, who tell me if I could build, the quintessential ranch that was really the staple of housing in this state for a very long time, I would. If I could do that, get in and out in, 60, 90, 120 days and do 10, 12 deals in a year, I would do that. But if you're doing one deal in a year, you're going to put all your eggs in that basket and you're going to maximize what your profits can be. And so in this moment where, not just Portsmouth, but the community I was born in, Narragansett and Charlestown, are really struggling. There is a high demand for second homes and vacation homes that are driving prices very high. And so it very much does price Rhode Islanders out of the market because there are funds in other states that we, like incomes that we can't even really compete with. Median income in this state is just about $70,000 a year. That's median income. So the typical Rhode Islander actually needs affordable housing, and most of the state qualifies for affordable housing. We can produce 1 unit for every 5 households who need it. That's about where we're at right now. So that means we have 4 households who, you know, are on the verge of homelessness, are spending exorbitant amounts of money on their housing costs, which means they're not fully participating in other economies. They're not saving for the future. They're not investing in their own futures. They're not able to provide for their children. So I think we see a lot of fallout when people are really heavily cost burdened, beyond just sort of the obvious of homelessness. There's a lot sort of on it, including sort of health, implications for health and healthy outcomes in the long term for people. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think it requires some action, right? It's not going to happen naturally for sure. That's not how the private market is designed, so.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Tibbetts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see that a lot. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No. Yeah, we see, again, like, I think it's figuring out how, right, you need a carrot and a stick, right? And so this is really kind of the carrot dangling out there. So we do see that a lot. And municipalities have adopted that as a strategy where they might do, again, the scale of the project certainly matters, but most projects are small scale. So they might do, you know, you can build 2 market rate units and then you have to produce a low mod unit, or, you know, for every 3 market rates, you build 2 low mod, and they're interdispersed like that. And also ensuring that the low mod units get sandwiched in the middle. So it's not on the tail end, right? Where it's like, oh, you build these last 2 market rates and then you build the last affordable, right, would be the very last unit. That one tends to languish because they've gotten all of their incentive at that point. So you really figure out, like, mathematically, what does that sort of development schedule look like? And how do you make building permit issuance contingent on the production of, it could be all sorts. I've seen COs, I've seen like substantial completion, right? Not quite at CO, but you're pretty close. And if somebody's like this close, they're not gonna not go all the rest of the way. So you can really structure it a whole sort of way. It really just, again, I think there's a lot of autonomy for you to decide, but that has been a very effective mechanism. Even when there are fees that can be leveraged, it's just an extra action, right? You need to call someone in, you need to do a thing. So it's just more of a proactive as opposed to being reactive.
Any other questions on the board? I think, why don't we just, I know we're online, just to see if there's anybody online that wants to ask a question. Okay. Okay.
This one.
Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions.
Go on vacation.
All right.
I say it looks muted.
He's muted.
Wait, can you hear me? Can you hear me? if you can hear me, my question is, how do we get mobile homes to be counted?
We hear you, Luke. Your question was, how do we get mobile homes counted?
Sure.
Yeah.
You could get mobile homes counted by making them low-income units officially. Relabeling them as low-income units is just a relabeling exercise that benefits the town. It doesn't benefit the homeowner in any way, shape, or form. So in full disclosure, when that bill has been presented at the legislature, we have testified against that every year and would every year that it continues to be presented. Again, I don't think it actually it might get the town to its 10%, but again, that to me is a very secondary goal. It's about producing housing for people that is affordable to them. And simply something being a mobile home doesn't in and of itself qualify it to be a low mod unit. So a low mod unit requires a subsidy. A low mod unit requires a monitoring agent. A low mod unit requires a long-term deed restriction of at least 30 years. And there requires to be an income certification process. So if a mobile home meets those requirements, it does in fact count. The Low Mod Act doesn't contemplate housing types, right? So it's not saying it couldn't be a tiny home or a mobile home or it can be any type of housing. We're not discriminating against housing types, but it does need to meet certain tests in order to count. So I believe it has been done successfully. And we did propose, it didn't pass, but we'll revisit it in a future session. We were very close. Actually, it passed the House, but it didn't pass the Senate. Where we were willing to count mobile homes if it was a resident-owned park. Again, I think people underestimate the vulnerability of mobile home park owners. Nationally, mobile home park owners are some of the lowest homeowners in the country, income-wise, well below 50% AMI often. And they're very vulnerable because they own this asset on a piece of land that is leased, generally by a private owner. And actually recently, well, maybe in like the last 6 months, everything feels recent, but I read an article about investment strategies, and the number one suggestion for investors was to purchase mobile home parks because the earning potential was limitless. And it means it leaves those park residents extremely vulnerable to rising pad fees. So maybe the home was cheaper, but if they're paying a pad fee of $400 or $600 or $1,000, there are no caps on those ground lease fees. So they become very unaffordable very quickly. And if they're not in compliance with the park owner's requirements around, keeping the property up or whatever the delinquency looks like, some of them have installed water and sewer infrastructure, and they pay for those. We do have mobile home parks that we monitor. It can get very costly for tenants, but also it leaves them subject to eviction because that property owner can actually evict them, even though they own the home. And it's actually not that easy to move your mobile home. There is substantial cost, usually about $8,000 or $10,000 to remove a mobile home from a pad site. So I think, we will remain opposed to any bill that simply looks to count them because we do believe that is really to the benefit of the town and the town alone. But we would certainly be supportive of any type of bill that looked to give some type of additional protections, like a resident-owned park where they form a co-op and they effectively own the land in community. So it's basically a condo association without the condo, right? And so they own title to the land as a nonprofit, and they would be the ones who set the pad fees And people are going to make very different choices, right? When they get to control their own costs. I mean, they'll have to do a budget and figure out the maintenance. So they're not really going to be able to lowball it, but they aren't going to have to deal with this sort of markup for investment profiteering, right? And so it takes that profit component out of it, which does actually make housing much more affordable to people. So we had drafted a bill, like I said, it passed the House, where it didn't require all of those the list of items that I had given you, because we thought it elevated some other thing that we thought was equally valuable, right? And so in saying that people have better housing stability, okay, maybe it doesn't have a deed restriction. I can live without that. If it offers something else. But I think this exercise in relabeling things to get to the 10% is a disingenuous effort in a time where we physically lack the number of housing units that are needed in this state. We are short something 25,000 housing units for our lowest income households, for people earning under $30,000 a year. So to be fully transparent, we did oppose that bill, but that's how you could get mobile homes counted, is if you supported a bill that did something else. You could also provide subsidy. I mean, you could make mobile homes affordable. So you could provide subsidy for improvements through CDBG. I assume, do you get CDBG? We worked with a developer in Southern Rhode Island to do mobile home replacement, where it was like a application process. People who had units that no longer were safe and sanitary could apply. CDBG dollars were used to acquire a new mobile home and cover the cost of replacing that unit. And in exchange for that, the person signed a deed restriction, right? So we met all of the requirements. That person was income qualified. And we serve as a monitoring agent. We have approximately 13 units, I think, statewide that are mobile homes who meet this. We've seen in the western part of the state, they did loans for mobile home acquisition, no interest and low interest loans to people who wanted to acquire. Again, same concept. Those dollars were the subsidy in exchange for a no interest loan. They signed a deed restriction, and we monitor those transactions. We actually had a resale recently. They were moving out of state, and we had a very young woman with a couple really cute little kids who was trying to get into her first home. And this was really the only thing the only opportunity that was remotely in her price point. So there is certainly ways to achieve it, but I think I can't say what the legislature will do, but it has not been successful in previous sessions to simply relabel. And there's been other attempts on other things. I think there was a bill last session around Section 8 vouchers, just counting those. Again, I think the problem at hand is not so much about getting towns to the 10%, but providing new housing opportunities to come online so that we can house Rhode Islanders. So,
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? All right.
easy,
Thank you very much. Very informative.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time and effort to come to see us.
not a problem. It's a nice drive. Although it's a little scary out there on East Main Road where you're like, oh, I don't know if my car's too wide for this. I didn't know if it was just me or if that's like a typical thing. Okay, all right. I'm like, I'm pretty tough, but I was.
Travels, thank you. Thank you. All right, item number 4, legal legislative updates, recent changes, whether Rhode Island. Sure, we can have a 2-minute stretch.
We need to stretch it.
All right. Stretch away.
The law that it says the meeting that goes past. Well, that guy died 10 years ago. No one's been in there since.
We have one of those in our neighborhood. Crazy.
Everybody read all the information I emailed to everybody.
I went through it, perused. I read the one that was in the packet and I did peruse your other stuff.
I made little sticky notes on it.
Needs. I
Okay,
am not an expert in this. All these, statutory regulations were passed in June. Most of the changes have to be, updated in our zoning and land use regulations as early as January 1st, 2024. Some, are later in the year. I just really want to go, high level review because this could really put us all to sleep very, very quickly.
sure.
And I don't want to do that to anybody, including myself. And since I gave everybody all the information, you can read this at your own pace. Rhode Island Housing has $4 million that towns can apply for, and we can hire a consultant that Rhode Island Housing will pay for to help us implement all these necessary changes. So in the coming weeks, Aaron Lindo, my colleague, and I will be obtaining a consultant to get these changes, and the consultant will work with us to get these changes implemented within our zoning ordinance and our land development regulations. Now that it's mid-October, there's a good chance we may not make the January 1st deadline, but there's no ramifications or negative, slap on the wrist if we don't make the January 1st deadline. It will just, state law will just take effect. Right. So, we're doing everything we can to get up to speed, and I really just want everybody here to get a flavor of what's to come.
Okay,
So, back in June, the state legislature, approved 13 of the 14 housing bills. The most important housing bill I'll just touch, base on quickly is, a modification to the accessory dwelling unit bill, which really needed to be tweaked due to the ambiguity, and it didn't pass. Ernie Almonte, who is with the League of Cities and Towns, has made reference to the fact that it could be re-upped and modified within the first 30 days of the new legislation taking place, so that could possibly change. I want to quickly talk about the Zoning Enabling Act, which does take effect on January 1st, 2024. And it amends the provisions of the Zoning Enabling Act of 1991 related to variances, special use permits, modifications, notice provisions, and substandard lots of record and lot merger. Nothing totally relevant to you, but more of the zoning board of review, where it amends the standards for granting a dimensional variance, specifically where it eliminates the grounds for the standards for the least relief necessary, which is pretty crazy, but we'll speak to the zoning board of review about that. Again, another issue that takes place January 1st, 2024 is adaptive reuse, where it encourages the conversion of existing commercial buildings to residential and mixed use as a permitted use, placing limitations on a municipality's authority to restrict density and dimensional requirements for adaptive reuse projects. Another bill that passed, which takes place starting January 1st, 2024, is that of transit-oriented development, which creates a transit-oriented development pilot program, TOD program, to encourage residential housing near convenient public transportations. And everything that I'm reading, I have provided to you. There's bulleted key changes to these bills. House Bill 6085, which is in regards to the comp plan implementation, requires a more specific implementation program through the creation of a strategic plan, including specific goals, actions, and timeframes for development of low to moderate income housing. We already do this where annual reporting of the status of implementation of the strategic plan. We need to give these plans to statewide planning. We just did that this past April. In regards to, this is relevant to us here for land development and subdivision regulations. This bill 6061 substitute A amends the Land Development and Subdivision Review Enabling Act of 1992 related to the role of the Planning Board, Technical Review Committee, and Administrative Officer. So that hits all of us in this room. Amends the definition and processes for land development projects and development plan review and requires a unified development review. So I'll just quickly go through the summary of key changes on this specific bill. It eliminates the zoning board as the planning board of appeal with respect to all development approvals, retained only for non-permitting decisions of administrative officer. That's Leon. Appeals from planning board decisions will now go directly to Superior Court. It broadens the authority of the administrative officer to review and approve qualified applications, and it expands who can be considered an administrative officer and permits more than one person to be designated as the administrative officer. So that means that Ed could be the administrative officer, another employee in the planning department can be an administrative officer, or somebody in the building department can be an administrative officer. For development plan review remains optional and provides a list of development types that can choose from to be permit to be reviewed under the development plan review. It also defines and standardizes the process for design development plan review. Again, I don't want to go into all of this. One thing that's super important here is that it defines and revises the definition of subdivisions, and a minor subdivision is now considered any subdivision creating 9 or fewer buildable lots. This is very much different than what we've seen in previous years where a minor subdivision was 5 or fewer lots. And now a major subdivision is now defined as anything of 10 or more buildable lots. So that's something we need to get used to. Other things that are really included in this, and I want you to really go back and read this on your own time. And again, I'm referring to land development and subdivision bill title H6061. So this is the one I really want you to focus on, is where the vesting for final plan is now 1 year instead of 90 days. Recertification of completeness is reduced from 14 to 10 days. Applications requiring a street creation or extension for the planning board shall be the review authority and is required to hold a public hearing. All these things I'm just reading right off of a bulleted list here. Moving on to, low mod income housing, House Bill 6081 amends the Low and Moderate Income Housing Act as it relates to density and parking requirements. The definition of meeting local needs, appeals of approval with conditions for profit developers eliminates the master plan stage or review and alters the findings of fact required for a decision. Obviously, when I write a staff report, I will include those findings of fact in my staff report. But this basically takes out the master plan need for a project. You'll just go to preliminary and final plan approval now. Which is a big deal. It significantly changes how LMI projects are reviewed. Inclusionary zoning, we don't really talk about that a lot here because we don't do it here. House Bill 6058 Substitute A, inclusionary zoning, again, takes place effective January 1st. Amends the provision of the Zoning Enabling Act related to inclusionary zoning by setting minimum density requirements, requiring a minimum percentage of LMI units, setting a minimum number of units as a trigger, and alters the fee and lieu provision. So, as Melina was talking earlier, amends the requirements that the minimum percentage go from 10 to at least 25% LMI units. Requires the minimum threshold over which inclusionary zoning be no greater than 10 units. Goes on. Judicial proceedings. Have not read this one. Oh, this eliminates the SHAB, which we have never in Portsmouth gone to the SHAB, have we? Okay. Yes. There's a new land court. I'm not gonna even talk about that since hopefully we never have to go down that route. Yeah. Yes, yes. That would go to this new land use court. So basically this bill 6060, which goes into effect January 1st. These two bills together consolidate all permitting approval appeals related to land use matters directly to Superior Court, abolishing the SHAB, which is the State Housing Appeals Board, and establishes a separate calendar for such appeals. So that's pretty significant in it.
Yeah.
Because like, a long tradition of zoning appeals, for example, get filed in the Superior Court, and then people wait years for
Years.
the judge to decide. This is under the two things, there's a land use, specialized court for all land development matters. So there's including zoning, for example, where there's a set time, so you gotta put your briefs in, and it's set time for decision, so things won't languish.
Wow.
for
Yeah.
years. Leave, whatever judge signs or county. So, then they assign someone else. Not the zoning decision. So I think that's cool.
Yeah, that is a significant improvement.
Move things along.
Oh, good. That's a good one.
The last one is in regards to notice requirements, nothing that would immediately affect you, and it has already taken effect. This took effect upon passage back in June. And it is notification requirements in terms of how applicants notify abutters and publication in newspapers. And that it's now, excuse me, we don't do certified mail anymore. It's just standardizes first-class mail instead of certified mail. Which is very good because sometimes the butters get scared when they see
Yeah.
certified mail.
That's right.
And we now use Portsmouth Times instead of Newport Daily News just because it gets so expensive to place an ad, legal advertisement in Projo and Newport Daily News. So I hate to be so quick and dirty with that, but myself, solicitors, developers, legal counsels that are representing applicants are all trying to get up to snuff and up to speed with all these new changes that are coming down the pike. And I'll be taking more classes just to get up to speed with this. I think there's gonna be some workshops for planning board members, even for town solicitors in the coming weeks and months. I highly recommend if you see a workshop to take a class. I think League of Cities and Towns is gonna be offering some workshops and classes just to get you acclimated to the changes. And Aaron and I are gonna be working with a consultant to help us out. And then this will dovetail into our whole update of our zoning ordinance as well.
If you hear about opportunities, virtual or whatnot, maybe you
Yes.
could pass those on to us.
I will
to-
definitely
To
do
the
that.
board. Thank you.
Mhm.
Any questions for Leah? Yeah, great. Substantial changes.
For the better, I think. There's a lot of things, especially in terms of like non-conforming lots that want to add an addition that have to always go to the zoning board, especially in the Island Park Common Fence Point. That is ridiculous. Now it just will get approved by the zoning enforcement officer. So little things like that are definitely to the betterment. And minor subdivision being 9 lots, like, that's a big deal.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was good. Thank you. No further questions? All right. So next up is the item 5, approve the October 11th monthly project status report. So we take a motion to receive and place on file. All right, is there a second? Mr. Garso, thank you. All right, so we got a motion made and second. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. And I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Kate, seconded by Dave Garso. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All right, we're adjourned.